There's something magical about cooking straight from the garden, where every tomato, every herb, and every leaf carries the taste of home. For generations, American families relied on what they could grow in their backyard, simple meals born out of necessity, but remembered for their flavor and warmth. Today, we're bringing back 15 forgotten garden-to-table recipes, dishes that remind us of a time when food wasn't just eaten, it was grown, nurtured, and shared. So, which of these garden recipes would you try first? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your memories or family favorites. And if you enjoyed this journey through forgotten garden cooking, don't forget to hit the like button, share this video with fellow food lovers, and subscribe so you never miss another recipe from the past brought back to life. Fresh tomato basil bruschetta, straight from the garden. There's nothing quite like the taste of a sun-ripened tomato, picked fresh from the garden. Juicy, sweet, and warm from the sun, it carries a flavor you'll never find in a supermarket. For centuries, Italian immigrants brought their traditions of simple garden cooking to America, and one of the easiest yet most satisfying dishes they shared was bruschetta. At its heart, it's nothing more than bread, tomato, basil, and a drizzle of oil, but the story it tells goes much deeper. In the early 1900s, when many immigrant families lived in tight city apartments, they still found ways to grow herbs in pots on windowsills and small community gardens. Tomatoes and basil were two essentials, thriving even in small spaces. Bruschetta became a bridge between old-world flavors and the new American life, a reminder that food doesn't need to be complicated to be extraordinary. The method was beautifully humble: day-old bread, toasted over fire or skillet, rubbed with garlic, and topped with chopped tomatoes tossed in olive oil, salt, and fresh basil. Farmers often made it in the field during harvest season, using whatever bread they had on hand. It was quick fuel, but it was also a celebration, because in each bite, you tasted the garden's full glory. During the Depression years, bruschetta found a new place in American kitchens. Families who had only a few vegetables growing in their yards could still create something that felt special. A plate of tomato bruschetta turned the simplest meal into an occasion, served proudly to neighbors or shared at Sunday suppers. Today, it remains timeless. When you bite into bruschetta made with fresh garden tomatoes, you're tasting a tradition over 100 years old, one that connects immigrants, farmers, and families through generations. It proves that forgotten recipes don't need fancy ingredients, just fresh food, handled with love. Zucchini fritters with herb dip, turning extra zucchini harvest into crispy bites. Every gardener knows one simple truth: once zucchini starts growing, it doesn't stop. One day you'll have none, and the next, baskets overflowing with the green bounty. For generations, American families faced the same delightful problem: what to do with all that zucchini. The answer was often found in old cookbooks and passed through kitchens: fritters. Crispy on the outside, tender inside, zucchini fritters turned excess harvest into golden bites of comfort. In the 1920s and 30s, home cooks relied heavily on creativity. Nothing went to waste, and zucchini became the perfect substitute for costlier ingredients. Shredded, salted, and pressed to release its water, it was mixed with flour, egg, and herbs before being fried in a hot skillet. The result? Crispy edges, soft centers, and a dish that tasted far richer than its humble parts. Many families paired fritters with a simple dip, often made from sour cream or homemade yogurt blended with chopped dill, parsley, or chives fresh from the garden. It wasn't just food, it was resourcefulness at its finest, stretching simple ingredients into something worth gathering around the table. During World War II's rationing years, zucchini fritters rose again in popularity. With meat and butter harder to come by, vegetables took center stage, and fritters offered both sustenance and flavor. Housewives proudly served them as a main dish, sometimes stacked high on platters during summer dinners, proving that even the most modest gardens could provide abundance. The beauty of fritters lies in their versatility. They were eaten hot with dips, tucked into sandwiches, or even saved cold for a farmer's lunch in the fields. Kids who might wrinkle their noses at plain zucchini suddenly loved the crispy fritter version. It was a clever way to transform garden surplus into something everyone could enjoy. Garden kale and bean soup, a hearty, depression-style dinner with fresh greens. There was a time in America when dinner meant stretching whatever you had in the garden and pantry. And nothing represents that spirit of resilience more than a simple pot of kale and bean soup. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't expensive, but it was filling, nourishing, and deeply comforting. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, millions of families faced bare cupboards and tight budgets. Meat was rare on the table, but beans, cheap, filling, and long-lasting, became the backbone of countless meals. Kale, one of the hardiest greens, was often grown in backyard gardens or even tucked into community plots. Together, these two humble ingredients made a soup that could feed a family without emptying a wallet. The process was beautifully simple. Dried beans were soaked overnight, simmered slowly until tender, then joined by chopped kale, onions, garlic, and sometimes carrots or potatoes if they were available. A pinch of salt, a splash of vinegar, or even a ham bone, if a lucky household had one, added depth to the flavor. The result was a rich, earthy soup that warmed both stomach and spirit. For immigrant families, this dish carried echoes of old-world traditions. Italians called it zuppa di cavallo, while Eastern European cooks prepared similar soups with cabbage and beans. Each bowl represented a blending of cultures, adapted to the American kitchen during hard times. What made kale and bean soup unforgettable wasn't just its taste, but the feeling it created. Families gathered around steaming bowls, breaking bread together, knowing that while money was scarce, love and resourcefulness could still put food on the table. In many ways, it was more than soup, it was survival, wrapped in warmth. Cucumber and mint cooler, refreshing drink using backyard cucumbers. Long before store-bought sodas and bottled iced teas filled American refrigerators, families turned to their gardens for refreshment. On sweltering summer days, when the sun beat down and work in the fields or backyard seemed endless, nothing cooled the body and spirit quite like a simple cucumber and mint cooler. It was more than a drink, it was a ritual of relief. In rural America, cucumbers were one of the easiest vegetables to grow. Their vines sprawled across backyard gardens, often yielding far more than a family could pickle or slice for the table. Paired with mint, another plant that grew abundantly and sometimes almost wild, the combination became the base for one of the most refreshing, forgotten beverages of the early 20th century. The preparation was beautifully simple: peeled cucumbers, grated or sliced thin, muddled with fresh mint leaves, then strained into cool water or lemonade. Some families sweetened it lightly with sugar or honey, while others added a splash of vinegar for a tangy twist. Poured over chipped ice, it became a farmhouse luxury on days when air conditioning didn't exist and shade under a tree was the only escape from the heat. For many, this cooler wasn't just about refreshment, it carried tradition. Immigrant families from Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean were already accustomed to using cucumbers and herbs in chilled drinks and soups. When those customs met the abundance of American gardens, the cucumber mint cooler became a staple at picnics, barn dances, and Sunday gatherings. During World War II, when rationing limited access to sodas and processed beverages, families returned once again to simple, homemade drinks like this. It was thrifty, natural, and above all, restorative. Children carried mason jars filled with it to the fields, while adults sipped it on porches after long days of work. Stuffed bell peppers with rice, a classic old cookbook recipe. Few dishes capture the heart of vintage American cooking quite like stuffed bell peppers. Bright, colorful, and filled to the brim, they represent a tradition of making the most out of what the garden provided. In the early to mid-1900s, when families wanted a meal that was both hearty and thrifty, stuffed peppers with rice became a star on the dinner table. Bell peppers thrived in backyard gardens, especially in the Midwest and South, where warm summers produced baskets full of them. Their hollow centers made them nature's perfect vessel, ready to be filled with whatever a family had on hand. Rice, inexpensive and filling, was often the main ingredient. Mixed with onions, tomatoes, and sometimes a bit of ground meat if it was available, the rice stuffing transformed peppers into a complete meal. The beauty of this recipe was its adaptability. In Depression-era kitchens, peppers might be filled with nothing more than rice, garden herbs, and scraps of vegetables. During more prosperous times, home cooks added cheese, beef, or sausage for a richer dish. Old community cookbooks from the 1930s and 40s are filled with variations, each reflecting the resources and creativity of the household. Stuffed peppers also carried an immigrant influence. Eastern European families brought recipes like dolma and galabki, cabbage or grape leaves stuffed with rice and meat, which easily inspired the American pepper version. By the 1950s, stuffed peppers had become a staple in church potlucks and Sunday suppers, always served with pride because they looked as impressive as they tasted. What made them unforgettable was their warmth. A pan of stuffed peppers bubbling in tomato sauce filled the kitchen with rich, savory aromas, promising comfort after a long day of work. Families often served them with fresh bread to soak up the juices, stretching the meal even further. Golden carrot salad, sweet, crunchy, and straight from the soil. There's something about the humble carrot that has always brightened the American table. Its cheerful color, earthy sweetness, and crisp bite made it a favorite in both gardens and kitchens. And in the early to mid-20th century, one of the most beloved ways to serve it wasn't in a stew or roasted on a pan, but as a chilled dish known as golden carrot salad. This recipe first gained attention in community cookbooks of the 1920s and 1930s, when families were looking for inexpensive yet nourishing dishes. Carrots were hardy, easy to grow, and stored well through the winter months. Shredded raw, they brought freshness to the table even when other vegetables were scarce. Mixed with fruit, sugar, and a tangy dressing, the result was a dish that felt both thrifty and surprisingly elegant. One popular version combined grated carrots with crushed pineapple and lemon juice, bound together with a touch of mayonnaise or whipped cream. The mixture was often molded in rings or served in little glass dishes, its bright golden orange color shining like a centerpiece. At church picnics, Sunday dinners, and even Depression-era holiday tables, golden carrot salad offered a splash of sunshine. For families raising children in those years, it was also practical. Carrots were praised for their nutrition, believed to improve the eyesight and strengthen growing bodies. Sweetened slightly with fruit, even picky eaters enjoyed them. Housewives proudly clipped recipes from newspapers, noting how easily the dish could be made from pantry staples and garden harvest. By the 1950s, variations of this salad appeared in glossy homemaker magazines. Some added marshmallows for a sweeter touch, while others folded in raisins or walnuts for extra crunch. It straddled the line between side dish and dessert, simple, economical, yet always eye-catching. Green bean and potato casserole, a vintage dish reimagined with fresh beans. In kitchens across America during the 1930s and 40s, casseroles were more than just meals, they were lifelines. They stretched ingredients, filled hungry stomachs, and turned modest harvests into something that felt whole and comforting. One of the most overlooked but truly classic combinations was the pairing of garden-fresh green beans and hearty potatoes, baked together in a casserole that spoke of thrift, tradition, and resilience. Green beans were among the most dependable crops in backyard gardens. Families planted rows of them in the spring, and by summer, baskets overflowed. Potatoes, meanwhile, were a staple root that stored well and could feed a family through lean months. When these two humble vegetables met in the same dish, they created a casserole that was hearty enough to serve as supper and thrifty enough to fit any budget. Early versions, found in community cookbooks of the 1930s, often layered sliced potatoes with blanched green beans, onions, and a simple white sauce or cream if it was available. Some households added a sprinkle of cheese, others used canned soup in later decades when convenience foods became popular. No matter the variation, the goal was the same: to transform garden staples into a meal that could be proudly set on the family table. During World War II, when rationing shaped how Americans cooked, the casserole once again proved its worth. A single dish could feed a large family, often using little more than vegetables, a bit of milk, and pantry spices. Housewives shared recipes in church bulletins and homemaker clubs, praising its ability to stretch the harvest. What made the green bean and potato casserole special wasn't just its taste, but its sense of togetherness. Served bubbling hot from the oven, it filled the kitchen with warmth and the promise of comfort. Families broke bread alongside it, grateful for what their gardens had given. Homemade pickled beets, turning root veggies into a tangy treat. Among all the vegetables that came out of the garden, few carried as much old-fashioned charm as the beet. Deep red, earthy, and often overlooked, it was a staple in early American gardens not just because it was easy to grow, but because it kept well through the winter. And one of the most beloved ways to enjoy them, especially in the days before refrigeration, was by pickling. Homemade pickled beets have roots that stretch back to the 1800s, when farm families learned to preserve the harvest for leaner months. By the 1920s and 30s, they had become a fixture in Depression-era kitchens. With just vinegar, sugar, salt, and a few spices, housewives transformed a simple root into something sweet, tangy, and long-lasting. It was frugality at its finest, but also a treat that brightened supper tables. Old cookbooks often suggested boiling the beets until tender, slipping off their skins, and then slicing them into jars before pouring over a spiced brine of vinegar, sugar, cloves, and cinnamon. The jars were sealed and stored in cellars, where they lasted for months. When opened, the beets were vibrant in both color and flavor, a splash of ruby red on an otherwise modest plate of meat and potatoes. Pickled beets weren't just thrifty, they carried tradition. Eastern European immigrants in particular brought recipes for borscht and beet salads, blending them with American preservation methods. Soon, no church potluck or Sunday dinner table was complete without a dish of jewel-toned beets glistening beside the main course. During World War II, with rationing in full force, pickled vegetables gained new popularity. Families leaned heavily on their gardens, and jars of beets lined pantry shelves as proof of hard work and ingenuity. Even children, who might not have loved boiled beets, often enjoyed the sweeter, tangier pickled version. Herb-infused cornbread, garden herbs baked into warm, fluffy bread. Few foods are as deeply tied to American history as cornbread. Born from native traditions and carried forward through generations, it was the bread of farmers, pioneers, and homesteaders. But in old community cookbooks and farmhouse kitchens, a special twist appeared: cornbread baked with fresh garden herbs. It was simple, resourceful, and a way to turn everyday bread into something fragrant and unforgettable. Cornmeal was a staple in nearly every rural pantry. Affordable, filling, and versatile, it provided sustenance through the Great Depression and both World Wars. Families often baked plain cornbread daily, serving it alongside soups, stews, or beans. But when fresh herbs were in season, chives, parsley, thyme, or sage, housewives folded them into the batter, transforming a humble loaf into a dish worthy of Sunday supper. The method was straightforward: cornmeal mixed with buttermilk, eggs, and a bit of lard or butter when available. Into this base went chopped garden herbs, releasing bursts of flavor as the bread baked. The aroma alone, warm corn mingling with earthy herbs, could fill a farmhouse kitchen and draw everyone eagerly to the table. For many immigrant families, herb-infused cornbread carried echoes of old-world baking. Italians added basil or rosemary, while German and Eastern European cooks folded in dill or caraway. Over time, these traditions blended with Southern cooking, where cornbread was already a cherished staple. The result was a uniquely American dish, flavored by both soil and heritage. During lean times, herb cornbread also represented thrift. It stretched simple ingredients into something that felt new and special without costing a dime more. Fresh herbs from the backyard added color, aroma, and a sense of abundance, even when money was scarce. Sun-dried tomato pasta, simple pasta with home-dried tomatoes. Before supermarkets lined shelves with jars of sun-dried tomatoes, American families made their own, right in their backyards. When gardens overflowed with tomatoes in late summer, the challenge wasn't growing them, but preserving them. Families canned, pickled, and stewed them, but another treasured method was drying them in the sun. And from those wrinkled, rhubarb pieces came one of the most flavorful forgotten dishes, sun-dried tomato pasta. Drying tomatoes was both a necessity and a tradition. Italian immigrants who settled in America brought with them the knowledge of laying sliced tomatoes out on wooden boards, covering them with cheesecloth, and letting the sun slowly concentrate their flavor. By the 1920s and 30s, this practice had spread to farming families, especially in warm regions where the sun did the work of preservation without costing a penny. The dried tomatoes were stored in jars of olive oil or simply packed away in cloth bags. In the dead of winter, when fresh vegetables were scarce, these sun-preserved treasures brought a burst of summer flavor to otherwise plain meals. One of the simplest and most beloved uses was tossing them into pasta. The recipe was straightforward yet deeply satisfying. Dried tomatoes were rehydrated in warm water or broth, then sautéed with garlic, onions, and garden herbs like basil or oregano. Mixed with pasta and sometimes topped with a sprinkle of cheese, it became a dish that was both hearty and fragrant, filling kitchens with the smell of herbs and rich tomato sweetness. During the Depression and war years, this dish was proof of resourcefulness, stretching a single handful of dried tomatoes to flavor an entire pot of pasta. Families didn't just eat, they remembered the summer harvest with every bite. Garden radish sandwiches, a farmhouse-style snack from the 1930s. Few foods capture the simplicity of old farmhouse living quite like the radish sandwich. Crisp, peppery radishes pulled straight from the soil, sliced thin, and laid across buttered bread, this humble dish was once a staple in rural kitchens and lunch pails. In an age when meals had to be quick, affordable, and nourishing, radish sandwiches offered exactly that. Radishes were one of the first vegetables ready in spring gardens. Hardy, fast-growing, and dependable, they brought color and freshness after long winters of root cellars and canned goods. Farmers often grew them in abundance, which meant they found their way into daily meals. Paired with bread, homemade loaves or bakery staples, they became a quick bite that carried the taste of the season. The traditional preparation was delightfully simple. Thick slices of bread were spread generously with butter, then topped with radish rounds and sprinkled lightly with salt. Some families added fresh herbs like chives or parsley, while others used cream cheese or lard when butter was scarce. No matter the variation, the combination of creamy fat, salty crunch, and sharp radish bite was unforgettable. During the Great Depression, radish sandwiches were celebrated for their thrift. A few homegrown vegetables and a slice of bread could become lunch for children, farmers in the fields, or even workers carrying lunch tins to factories. Old community cookbooks from the 1930s list them as spring sandwiches, a name that captured their freshness and seasonality. Immigrant traditions also influenced this dish. German and Eastern European families had long enjoyed bread, butter, and radishes as a classic pairing. When those customs reached American kitchens, they fit perfectly into the rhythms of rural and small-town life. Pumpkin and squash stew, comfort food made from autumn harvest. When the air turned crisp and leaves began to fall, American families once turned naturally to their gardens for warmth and nourishment. Pumpkins and squashes, plentiful, hardy, and long-lasting, were more than decorations for the porch, they were the heart of autumn suppers. Among the most comforting dishes of the season was a simple yet hearty pumpkin and squash stew, a recipe that carried both thrift and tradition. Pumpkins have deep roots in American cooking, stretching back to indigenous peoples who roasted, boiled, and stewed them long before European settlers arrived. By the 1800s, stewed pumpkin and squash had become a common farmhouse meal. Families relied on them not just for flavor but for survival, since these vegetables stored well in cellars through the winter months. The stew was humble yet deeply satisfying. Chunks of pumpkin and squash simmered slowly with onions, carrots, and potatoes, often seasoned with herbs from the last of the garden. Some added beans or grains to stretch the dish further, while others, when they could afford it, dropped in bits of pork or beef bones for richness. For many, though, it was purely a vegetable stew, meatless, but nourishing enough to fill a table of hungry farmhands. During the Great Depression, pumpkin and squash stew re-emerged as a go-to dish. With money scarce, housewives leaned on hardy vegetables to feed their families. This simple stew could be served plain one night, then mashed and baked into a pie or casserole the next, ensuring nothing ever went to waste. Immigrant families also left their mark, blending old-world traditions with American harvests. Italian families flavored the stew with garlic and olive oil, while Eastern Europeans added cabbage or dill. Each version was unique, yet the heart of the dish remained the same, a warm, fragrant bowl that celebrated the garden's final bounty. Fresh berry ambrosia salad, a vintage salad refreshed with garden berries. Once upon a time, a dish called ambrosia was the crown jewel of American potlucks and holiday tables. Meaning food of the gods, it was first popularized in the late 1800s and remained a beloved treat through the 20th century. Traditionally, it featured canned pineapple, oranges, and coconut, rare luxuries that made it feel special. But in farm kitchens and backyard gardens, a simpler, fresher version thrived, ambrosia salad made with berries straight from the soil. In the 1920s and 30s, families who grew strawberries, raspberries, or blackberries often folded them into this vintage salad. Instead of relying solely on canned fruit, they took what the garden offered, mixing sweet berries with cream, sugar, and sometimes marshmallows for a touch of whimsy. The result was lighter, fresher, and deeply seasonal, bringing the taste of summer sunshine to the table. This dish often appeared at church picnics, family reunions, and Sunday suppers. Served in glass bowls, the contrast of fluffy cream against jewel-toned berries made it as beautiful as it was delicious. For children, ambrosia salad felt like dessert disguised as a side dish. For adults, it was a chance to showcase the bounty of their gardens in a way that felt celebratory. During the Depression and wartime years, cooks adapted based on what they had. Some used evaporated milk whipped with sugar when cream wasn't available, while others substituted home-dried coconut for the store-bought kind. Despite shortages, the spirit of ambrosia, a dish that turned humble ingredients into something heavenly, remained intact. By the 1950s, glossy magazines and Jell-O advertisements modernized the recipe, sometimes encasing it in molds. Yet the garden berry version remained closest to its roots, simple, fresh, and unforgettable. Spinach and onion quiche, creamy, savory pie using fresh greens. Before quiche became a brunch staple in American cafes during the 1970s, humble farmhouse kitchens were already baking savory pies with whatever greens the garden provided. Spinach and onions were among the most common, easy to grow, hearty, and available in nearly every backyard garden across America. In the 19th century, rural families relied heavily on garden greens to stretch their meals. Spinach, with its tender leaves, and onions, with their bold flavor, were natural companions. Women baked them into custard-like pies held together by eggs and cream from the family cow. While these rustic versions weren't yet called quiche, they carried the same comforting essence, a golden, flaky crust encasing the freshest produce. Old cookbooks from the early 20th century often described these dishes as savory custard pies rather than quiche. It wasn't until after World War II, when American soldiers returned from Europe, that the French word quiche became widely known here. Yet the truth is, farmers' wives had been making their own version long before, born out of necessity, not sophistication. This dish was more than food, it was resourcefulness baked into a pie pan. A single quiche could turn a basket of garden spinach and a few onions into a full meal, feeding an entire family when paired with bread or soup. Its versatility made it a year-round favorite, light enough for summer but hearty enough for winter. By the mid-20th century, spinach and onion quiche made its way onto picnic tables, community suppers, and church potlucks. Some added cheese if they could afford it, while others flavored it with herbs picked right from the yard. Each version was unique, carrying the stamp of the cook's own garden. Homemade herbal tea blend, mint, chamomile, and garden herbs brewed to perfection. Long before the supermarket shelves filled with boxed tea bags, American families often relied on their own gardens for a comforting cup of tea. Herbs like mint, chamomile, lemon balm, and even raspberry leaves were gathered, dried, and stored in jars, ready to be steeped into soothing blends for every season. In pioneer days, tea wasn't always easy to come by. Imported black tea was expensive, and many households couldn't afford it. Instead, families turned to what they had on hand, fragrant herbs growing along fence lines, in kitchen gardens, or even wild in nearby fields. Chamomile brought calm after a long day's work. Mint refreshed the spirit and settled the stomach. Raspberry and blackberry leaves were brewed for health and strength. These homemade teas weren't just beverages, they were medicine, comfort, and ritual all in one. During the Great Depression, when every penny counted, making herbal tea from the garden was both thrifty and practical. Children often helped gather sprigs of mint or small blossoms of chamomile, carefully laying them out to dry in the sun. Once stored, these blends provided families with warmth in the winter months, when fresh produce was scarce but a hot drink could lift the soul. By the mid-20th century, community cookbooks and homemaker guides often included tips for kitchen garden teas. Some recommended mixing mint and chamomile together, while others encouraged adding dried rose petals for a gentle floral note. These blends were less about strict recipes and more about creativity. Each household had its own signature flavor. Even today, when we sip a cup of homemade herbal tea, there's something deeply grounding about it. You're not just drinking herbs, you're sipping the seasons, the sunlight, and the soil of your own backyard. It's a taste of self-reliance and connection to the past.